For once in his life, John was wrong. The pessimistic bugger said he'd be dead by 60. It was his exposure to a couple of strains of hepatitis, or his asthma, or some other chronic issue apparently. When he turned 60, he revised the prognosis to death by 65, and on it went in 5-year intervals of survival. He eventually left us with 85 years to celebrate, which is what this little presentation is all about. We could rattle through an enormous list of his lifetime's achievements, and that would highlight his drive, intelligence, and ability to work both hard and smart, but it wouldn't illustrate the depth of his character, nor paint much of a picture of the man who was far more complex than most people were ever able to see. I'll touch on his achievements along the way, but what I hope to do is either remind you of or enlighten you about the ways John could delight, surprise, and shock you, sometimes when you least expected it. He had that mischievous streak in him that enjoyed being contradictory and sometimes paradoxical, and he revelled in it. I think he hated the idea of being predictable. Before I get into all of that though, I'll do what I didn't want to do, and that's start at the beginning. It's impossible to put any of John's later life into context without knowing what happened in the first 13 years of his life, before he came with his family to Australia. John's father, Jim, was an Imperial Airways pilot specialising in Middle Eastern routes. This entailed frequent reposting of the family to different bases, and World War II only increased the relocations. John became a refugee of war 3 times, once when the family was rounded up, put in trucks and driven to a concentration camp in the North African desert while being jeered at and spat upon by the local Arabs, who of course detested the British Empire's rule. Timing, though, is everything. Rommel's forces were defeated that night and they retreated. John said the Arabs were far more polite as they drove the Brits home the next day. His mother, Martha, was the 4th generation of a Scottish cotton trading family in Egypt. She spoke 8 languages and insisted her children not be separated from the local culture wherever they lived. John grew up in a cultural mixing pot, speaking 4 languages and eating whatever was put in front of him. Before coming to Australia, the family lived in Pakistan and was there through the horrendous partition. Fighting raged around them, and while John had seen plenty of death already, this time he saw garbage trucks piled so high with bodies that some would fall off as they drove around the corner outside the Matheson residence. John and his siblings, Lyris and Kyle, clocked up tens of thousands of air miles. It was no big deal when for a few terms he was put on a plane alone and sent to England. That was just how he got to primary school. Not that he had much schooling. I think he did maybe 2 terms. Growing up in those days of empire and formality and adventure had its benefits. He had a lot of freedom. He also lived the high life in a family supported by generous allowances that made up for Jim's fairly modest income. It was expected that pilots and their families should mix with the gentry of the empire, so they had allowances for a certain number of servants, for better accommodation, and so on. The free and easy high life ended as the British Empire crumbled, and when Jim and Martha brought their children to Australia in 1951, they were not well off at all. In fact, Martha took to running a boarding house, while Jim went to work on the Snowy scheme. Their struggles eventually made John determined that he'd do better. And that brings us to the many things that John Matheson was. John was incredibly determined, for starters. When he put his mind to something, nothing stopped him. He had no real education before high school. Those couple of brief forays to English boarding school were about it. He didn't start schooling until going to Scots in Sydney. By his own admission, he wasn't very good, but he became the first of his family to go to university and emerged a doctor. Not many people go from being a semi-literate 13-year-old to an acclaimed neurosurgeon. It takes a lot of determination. It also speaks of the fact that John was a highly intelligent man with an intimidating intellect. He said neurosurgery was the only branch of medicine that appealed to him because it was the only one that would challenge his intellect. Mind you, he also said the only reason he did medicine in the first place was because he loved the uni life and medicine was the longest uni course you could do. John was also amazingly resilient and stoic. It showed in all sorts of ways, but I particularly remember the way he hunkered down in that little 100-year-old de Dion Bouton and drove it from Peking to Paris in every condition imaginable. He also suffered through that dreadful disease, as he called Parkinson's, right to the end, despite pain and humiliation and decrepitude. so that he could enjoy the last few things left to him, particularly little Eve and Sadie. He could have opted out, but no, he wouldn't. I always thought he'd choose euthanasia, being the pragmatist that he is, but no, because John was a contrarian. He was probably that way from birth, and his birth certificate offers some proof. It's Palestinian because that's where he was born in 1938, when it existed as a state under British rule. John also was of Jewish descent, German Egyptian Jews at that, and of course he was a British subject. So that made him a Pommy Palestinian Jew of Scottish, German and Egyptian heritage, with a world war raging around him and its aftermath shadowing his preteen years. A kid like that today would probably be a therapist's superannuation dream. When you are all of those things, you could almost be expected to go to war with yourself. John enjoyed the fact that he could be any and all of those characters in a discussion, often just to be contrary. The worst thing about John being contrary was that John was always right. Even when he wasn't, he somehow was. He was hard to argue with, but the most infuriating thing is that when you were sure he was wrong, it was more likely that you were. He read a lot, and he retained it all in a photographic memory, so you had to be pretty good on any topic you'd wish to challenge him about. You didn't really have to challenge him either. Being such a contrarian, he'd usually adopt the opposite point of view from yours just for the fun of it, and he was always right. John was a humanist. He felt for people who suffered, something he could not avoid even if he'd had the most detached bedside manner in the world. We all know that a doctor has to be able to rationalise death and move on, or be consumed by it. John generally would never bring home his work with him, though sometimes he'd come home a little withdrawn. He preferred the funny stories, like when he rushed in to save a bloke who'd shot himself in the head, only to find that the guy had been so drunk he'd inflicted merely superficial wounds, that the bottle of whiskey he'd guzzled had made him so sick he'd puked out all the sleeping pills he'd swallowed, and now he was sitting up in bed trying to chat up the nurses. But there's only so much anyone can bear, and John showed it mostly on the rare occasions he spoke about Vietnam. His story of saving a young girl's life on the ground, outside a makeshift hospital, after he'd felt her pulse fade and stop as she bled out from a landmine wound, always brought him to tears. The girl recovered and walked out a short time later, and that filled him with pride. John was a proud man. He was proud, for example, of his service in Vietnam, the lives he saved and the differences he made. Did you know he kept his service medals? He never wore them, but he made sure he applied for and got them. He wasn't proud for no reason. He was enormously yet quietly proud of everything he achieved. It was justified because he worked very hard for it. That's not to say he didn't have some luck, although of course everyone makes their own luck, and I think he was good at it. Fortune's greatest favour was his purchase of a pile of rubble on top of a cliff in an industrial suburb of Sydney in the late 1970s. At the bottom of the cliff was a patch of land slowly crumbling into Sydney Harbour. He built a house on it, fixed the seawall and garden, and got the neighbourhood's first approved pontoon to moor a boat. About 15 years later, the shipyards and the blue-collar workers were gone, and Longnose Point, Birchgrove, had become one of Sydney's must-have waterfront addresses. He'd paid 5 figures for it. He sold it for 7. That's what really set him up. John was good at working systems. He needed to borrow money to build his house in Louisa Road in Birchgrove, but the bank wouldn't lend for house building. It was too risky or something. John had enough money put aside to pay his large impending tax bill, so he did what any anti-authoritarian individualist would do and spent his tax money on a 2-storey brick home with 3 bedrooms and huge windows facing the harbour. Then he went back to the bank and applied for a loan to cover his tax bill. "No problem, Dr Matheson," said the bank manager. Actually, that reminds me, did you know John almost didn't become a surgeon? The terms of his university scholarship dictated that he should become a psychiatrist. His towering intellect, his ability to read and retain, his analytical and inquisitive mind, and his unadorned humanity would have made an ideal resume for the job. Knowing John's way of dealing with people, I'm sure you'll agree that Australia's emotionally feeble and mentally tormented probably dodged a bullet when John went to work on their brains instead of in their minds. He had to flee the country to avoid being indentured into psychiatry, moving to New Zealand and coming home a couple of years later as a budding neurosurgeon. Incidentally, I'll let you make what you will of some of John's university results. He failed first-year psychology, but picked up his act to the point where in his final year he earned a credit in gynecology. I'll leave discussion of his professional life to Dr Paul Poulgrain, who who is eminently placed to do justice to an amazing career, but I do want to pass on some lessons in how to be contrary as a neurosurgeon. The first is to get into farming, blisters and all. In the 1970s and 80s, John was what they used to call a Pitt Street farmer, working in Sydney all week and visiting his country estate on weekends, but he didn't stuff around. I used to laugh at how shocked visitors were when they saw his hands, the same ones that artfully guided scalpels into people's brains and nervous systems, wrapped around a crowbar as he smashed it through rocky ground to dig a fence post hole. He loved that hard work. He didn't always work on the farm though. The one he had in the 1970s was renowned for its parties. There was nakedness, heavy drinking, tripping and more. You could never define or confine John to being just one thing, just one kind of person. John would generally do what he wanted and see no conflict in it. That's John the Libertarian. He grew up with a lot of freedom. When he went to Sydney University, he became part of the Push, an anti-establishment, left-leaning group of critical thinkers who valued liberty and freedom in a way that frightened the hell out of conservative Australia's major social and democratic institutions. They followed dangerously heretical social philosophies, railed against government and church, and defended puffs and commies. If that seems paradoxical in light of John's outward conservatism, that's just the way it was. He was a libertarian up to his death. And if you couldn't see much left-leaning philosophy in his day-to-day attitudes, it was still there in a general sense. John was an adventurer. It's hardly surprising after his upbringing. He loved to travel and combined it particularly with his love of cars. He also sailed, having owned both a yacht and a large motorboat that he did a number of voyages in. There are very few parts of the world that he didn't see. From Antarctica to the North Pole, up the Alps and the Himalayas, through famous European cities and across the Australian outback, everywhere. He twice drove from Peking to Paris, once in the Queen's former Rolls-Royce and once in that little de Dion Bouton. John was a driver. He loved being at the wheel and going somewhere. The first car he ever drove was a supercharged Alfa that his father had commandeered in Africa during the war. John was 5. He worked out he could stand on the starter button and propel the little sports car down the road. He was quite proud of that. Another of his paradoxical traits was that he particularly loved English cars, despite them. The first new car he bought was a Mini, one of the first in the country, I believe, and he toured it all the way to Cairns, then took it to New Zealand when he had to escape the threat of psychiatry. He owned a magnificent Jaguar V12 saloon in the 1970s, a car that spent so much time in the workshop he ditched it quickly. He didn't baby his cars. There are photos of that Jaguar up to its doors in a swollen creek. He was a skillful driver and liked to go quick. He pushed the Jaguar to 230 kilometres an hour one day, and just as he backed off, a front tyre blew. As his passenger clawed his way up the seat in terror, John gingerly guided the careening car down the road, not touching the brakes, taking out guideposts on both sides of the road, and eventually coasted to a safe halt. He especially loved his 1924 Rolls-Royce Silver Ghost. He did about 50,000 miles in it, including in the US and Europe. John was, of course, a husband, a father and a grandfather. He married twice, first to Jane, who he met at university, and then to Jean, who was his partner in everything for a few years shy of half a century. We 4 children have our own stories. Underlying all of them is the fact that John wanted the best for us and gave us every opportunity. We've all done well for ourselves, and he can take much of the credit. John was certainly a very generous man, and it wasn't just we in the family who felt the gift of that. There's only 2 more things I want to say about the man John was. We can't finish without having a bit of a laugh with him, or maybe at him. If you knew John, you knew he had a hell of a temper. Fortunately, it flashed briefly and then faded, and it mellowed over the years, but I've got 2 good stories from the 1970s, both times at Glen Heather, the farm that was, he said, the only one of many great properties that he ever regretted selling. He went up there to work one weekend and found a party going on. After a big week and a long drive, he went straight to bed but couldn't sleep for the music blaring out. So he got up, quietly strode to the record player, picked it up and smashed it on the floor. Then he jumped on it for good measure and went back to bed, leaving stunned but blessed silence in his wake. Another day he arrived in his V8 Falcon, only to find that someone had left a gate open and the stock were wandering out up the hill. He didn't stop, but screamed up the rough track after them, tyres spinning and dirt flying, and managed to tear out the sump plug on a rock. He realised the problem at the top of the hill, so slammed the car into reverse and floored it down the hill again. At the bottom, he spun it round to drive back towards the house, but hit a stump that stoved in the rear end and flattened a tyre. Not done, he floored it again, fishtailing up to the house and screeching to a smoking halt as the last of the oil dropped out of the bottom. He then stormed into the now empty house, slamming the door behind him. A bloke named Bozo, who was the only person everyone reckoned was immune to John's wrath, was pushed in behind him. Bozo found John with a bottle of whiskey to his lips, taking a long draught. John just looked at him, lowered the bottle and said with a grin, "Well, I fucked that, didn't I?" John also had a seriously mischievous streak. He and his siblings in Europe used to set fire to sheds to see how long it would take the fire brigade to show up. He filled the fuel tanks of Sydney University Regiment's trucks with sugar in an act of anti-war protest, although I doubt he was particularly driven by the political statement, more by the rebelliousness of it. The Sydney Uni medical faculty was notorious in the 1960s for pranks involving body parts, although John never ever admitted being involved with that, and if he ever was, I think he was appalled by it later on. I do know that he and a university mate climbed Sydney Town Hall one night and stole the Australian flag from its pole. You'll see it in one of the photos here. Please enjoy the photos. There's a story behind every one. Let's celebrate John's life.
You have heard today a bit what made Dad so memorable in his life and now in his death. His atypical upbringing with Carl and Lyris, early university escapades and wild liberties, his life with Jane and 2 young sons, an esteemed medical career, being a dad the second time around with 2 girls, a half-century of adventures with Jean, and then of course all the grandkids. He valued sharp minds, endless games of Minesweeper and Sudoku, arguments on anything, deep intellects, the silence of growing orchids, digging trenches in the mud, stimulating conversations, tinkering with cars, predicting World War III, jousting with real estate agents, and bad-mouthing politicians. You, of course, have your own stories, memories, and impressions of John, and the fact that you are all together in this room or watching online is testament to the very rich and fulfilling life he led. To make this really loud, please shout out if you know John through car and boat adventures, university escapades, medical times, John's friends, via his kids, or part of his family, contractual or by blood. All of these shouts are the greatest goodbye anyone could hope for, and being the drama queen he occasionally was, John would have loved hearing them. I wanted to spend a few more minutes talking about family. A complex man, one thing that was core to him was his family. And in the time that I knew him, almost all his decisions were taken with the welfare of his family in the back of his mind, even if we, on the receiving end, didn't always agree with his conclusions. Having recently become a parent myself, I have a much better understanding of the responsibility and at times the fear that comes with knowing you have people you love dependent on you, and wanting the best for them in a world that can increasingly seem fragile. Dad was above all a logical man, but he is also one that felt emotions deeply, though he seldom betrayed them. He also wasn't really one for words, but I wanted to share my memories on how he described his children. Michael, Mick, the firstborn, the oldest and hence the breaker of the initial barriers. He described you as the smartest one of the lot. He loved that he could discuss any subject with you and that you were wide-read and objective. He appreciated that you were mechanically minded, even if he deeply hated motorbikes. Indeed, I know for a fact that according to him, the only thing worse than a tattoo was a motorbike. Yet somehow a 3-wheeler was much better in his mind, and he travelled halfway around the world with you perched precariously on one. I'm sure he thought he was watching out for you, though I imagine the reverse was more likely. He enjoyed quiet times on Glen Heather and felt very welcome by you and Anne. You gave him his first granddaughter, Ariel, who he loved and always wanted to connect more with, though he may have always felt a bit out of step. James, Jim, the second-born, the first engineer and the more quietly spoken one. He always looked forward to catching up and talking with you, and after these visits you always prompted him to go on a rabbit hole search in some topic area. Years ago I remember it was underground radar. More recently it was electric cars. And I particularly liked seeing that in his first discussion he would disagree with you, as was his custom. But a few weeks later, after reading some controversial article in the newspaper, he would then feed your opinion back to me as accepted fact. One of the last of these technical rabbit holes was how much concrete was affecting global warming, and he mentioned that he would have to ask James about that. He was proud of your and Kara's dedication to your family unit, and avidly watched Millie, Emma and Sophie grow up into the amazing women they are. And Marion, the child I think he was the most proud of and scared for by entering into the medical profession. He called you a brilliant doctor who should be running the hospital, in the same breath as being worried you were being taken advantage of. Your working life has and will mirror most closely his own, and he knew the toil it could take. But he also saw you as an excellent mother to your girls, providing for them with Dave, who he complimented by calling him an Irishman who could cook and who he could understand, mostly. You also gave him the greatest joy of the last 6 years of his life in the format of Eve and Sadie, allowing him to grow young and play with kids in a way that he may never have had time to do with his own children or older grandchildren. Marion, it should be noted that with Mum, you carried an extremely heavy mental load of medical advice, treatment, and advocation for what could be a very stubborn, sick and old man, as Dad's Parkinson's developed over the last years, and I thank you so much for that. In the end, his last real day of life, he played with his grandkids, ate dinner with his family with a view over the bush and the harbour, and I can't imagine he would have changed a minute of it. And me, the youngest one, that got to ride through on the coattails of my siblings, who broke almost all the barriers before, who maybe got to see a more relaxed side of Dad who could say things about his other children to my face that he could only ever say when you weren't there. I'm happy Dad got to meet Chloe, even if only virtually, your most recent surprise grandchild. I have no doubt you would have fondly called her your little bastard granddaughter, and that she would have lapped up your attention and smiles. Lastly, a little note to Mum. A short minute of words can't describe your partnership, the trials and tribulations you made it through, or the happiness and success that you created together. The many little routines you had going around, going out for quick coffees, small walks, dinner parties with friends, activities with the car clubs, boat adventures of all sizes, rallies, visiting different cultures and countries, racing kids, navigating a gazillion house moves, and many, many more. The actual crimes you committed together by shooting out noisy factory alarms and stealing back impounded boats, using a young James as a lookout. Neighbouring up to the Bandito bike gang by impressing them with dirt bike antics. And pretending to be part of the royal family by getting Tony to chauffeur drive you through a security cord onto the Opera House in a Rolls Royce. You were the one that pushed Dad into a vibrant social life, kept him organised, funneled passion and motivation into concrete plans, did the hard, gritty work with him, and kept him enjoying his life even until the very end. With him to his final minutes, you allowed him to pass away without pain, in the company of people that loved him. For everyone today, please share your memories of Dad loudly and generously. He was someone that ultimately gave more than he took, which is what we can all only strive for in life. He was loved, and he will be missed.